If I could go back to my 50-year-old self and have one conversation about health, this is exactly the list of mistakes I would warn him about specifically. These are not theoretical mistakes from a textbook, but the actual decisions I made over the years that produced consequences I am still measuring decades later today. The science behind each one was available at the time, but I either did not know it existed, or worse, I dismissed it because it contradicted conventional advice. Each of these 7 mistakes accelerated something specific in my biology that took years or decades to fully reveal itself in measurable health markers and physical capacity. Most adults over 50 are making at least 3 of these same mistakes right now, often without realizing the cumulative damage compounding silently inside their bodies daily. The good news is that several of these mistakes are partially reversible, if addressed early enough, before the underlying biology has crossed certain physiological thresholds permanently in your body. The bad news is that each year you wait makes the reversal slower and less complete, which is why this conversation matters more than almost any other I could have. Here are the 7 specific health mistakes I made starting around age 50, what each one cost me biologically, and what I would do differently if I had another chance. Quick note before we start the list, because what comes next is dense, and you may want a structured framework to apply these corrections together in your daily routine. I put all 7 corrections together into a 30-day plan called the Longevity Blueprint, which I will mention again at the end for those who want the practical version. Mistake 1, I ignored soluble fiber completely for almost 20 years, eating maybe at 10 or 15 grams per day when the research suggested 30 to 40 grams was needed. The consequence was that my gut microbiome shifted toward inflammatory species, and a specific beneficial bacterium called Akkermansia mucinifila dropped to nearly undetectable levels in my system. That bacterium produces short-chain fatty acids that protect the gut lining, reduce visceral fat, and improve insulin sensitivity across the entire body through multiple biological pathways working together. What I would do now is eat oats, flaxseed, chia, avocado, berries, and legumes daily, hitting at least 30 grams of fiber from real food sources consistently. Mistake 2, I skipped resistance training entirely after age 50, believing that walking and gardening were enough physical activity to maintain my muscle and overall functional capacity adequately. The consequence was anabolic resistance, where my aging muscle cells stopped responding to normal protein intake, requiring much higher leucine doses per meal to trigger any growth. By age 65, my grip strength had dropped 20%, my sit-to-stand became labored, and I started worrying about falls that had never been a concern before. What I would do now is 2 short resistance sessions per week, with 25 grams of protein at every meal hitting the leucine threshold needed to trigger muscle synthesis. Mistake 3, I took calcium supplements without vitamin K2 for almost a decade, following doctor advice that sounded reasonable, but turned out to be biologically incomplete and somewhat dangerous. The consequence was that calcium accumulated in my arterial walls instead of my bones, increasing my coronary calcium score significantly, while my bone density continued to decline anyway despite supplementation. Vitamin K2 activates a protein called osteocalcin that physically binds calcium into bone matrix, and another called matrix GLA protein that keeps calcium out of arteries effectively. What I would do now is 100 to 200 micrograms of vitamin K2 as MK7 daily, alongside vitamin D3, magnesium, and weight-bearing exercise. Mistake 4, I drank coffee on an empty stomach every morning for 20 years, treating it as just my normal wake-up ritual without thinking about what it actually did. The consequence was that my cortisol spiked dramatically on top of the natural waking cortisol surge, producing chronic HPA axis dysregulation over many years of daily exposure. This chronic cortisol elevation drove visceral fat accumulation, accelerated brain aging through hippocampal damage and some points, and made me feel wired but tired throughout middle age in ways I did not understand. What I would do now is wait 60 to 90 minutes after waking before any caffeine, let the morning cortisol curve complete naturally, and eat protein with my first coffee. A quick mention before we go further, because what comes next is the most painful mistake I made, and the one that surprised me most when I finally understood the science. I wrote a book about this called The Longevity Blueprint, with a 30-day plan that puts the corrections to all 7 of these mistakes together coherently. More on that toward the end of the video, for those who want the full framework of what I would do differently with a second chance at health. This is Dr. Kenzo Longevity, where I explore the actual science behind interventions most adults have never had properly explained to them anywhere by anyone before in their lives. Mistake 5, I ate refined carbs at every meal believing them to be normal everyday food, never considering what happened to my blood sugar in the hours following. The consequence was decades of postprandial glucose spikes that drove glycation throughout my entire body, the process by which excess glucose binds to proteins and damages tissues silently. Glycation accelerated my skin aging, my eye lens clouding, my cardiovascular disease progression, and my cognitive decline simultaneously across all of my organ systems in measurable ways. What I would do now is apply 3 simple tricks at every meal: vinegar before eating, vegetables and protein first, then walking to activate GLUT4 uptake. Mistake 6. I treated sleep as a luxury rather than a biological necessity, sleeping 5 or 6 hours per night and proudly telling people I functioned fine on that amount. The consequence was that my lymphatic system, the brain cleaning mechanism that operates primarily during deep sleep, never had enough time to clear accumulated beta amyloid and tau proteins overnight. By age 60, my memory had subtly declined in ways my family noticed before I did, and my blood markers showed elevated inflammation traced directly back to chronic sleep restriction. What I would do now is protect 7 to 8 hours of sleep as non-negotiable nightly, keep my bedroom cool and dark, and stop screens 1 hour before bed. Mistake 7 hit me hardest when I finally understood the science, because I had actively avoided eggs and cholesterol for most of my adult life on conventional medical advice. I believed for decades that dietary cholesterol caused heart disease, and I limited eggs to once or twice per week while loading up on processed seed oils as the alternative. The consequence was that I starved my body of the precursor molecule it needed to synthesize testosterone, vitamin D, bile acids, and the cellular membranes of every cell. By age 65, my testosterone had dropped to levels that explained the fatigue, the muscle loss, the low mood, and the abdominal fat creeping up over 15 years. The science had shifted in the early 2000s, showing that dietary cholesterol has minimal effect on blood cholesterol in most adults, but the message took decades to reach public. What I would do now is eat 3 to 4 whole eggs per day, prioritize quality animal protein, and let my body have the cholesterol it needs for hormone production. Now, to the honest limits of this retrospective video, because looking back at mistakes is useful only if it leads to specific actions you can take starting tomorrow morning consistently. The title says I made these mistakes at 50, but the reality is that some of them started in my 40s, and the cumulative damage was already significant by 60. The earlier you address each of these 7 areas, the more reversible the damage tends to be, with most being substantially improvable even in your 70s if you start now. None of these corrections require expensive supplements, exotic protocols, or radical lifestyle changes, but all of them require consistency over months and years to produce measurable results. The cumulative effect of fixing all 7 is significantly larger than the sum of fixing any one of them, because they reinforce each other through shared biological pathways. Now to the safety section briefly, because while all 7 corrections are generally safe, several specific situations require medical supervision before making any major changes to your routine. Anyone with diagnosed kidney disease should consult their nephrologist before increasing protein intake, taking magnesium supplements, or modifying their dietary potassium intake through fiber and vegetable increases significantly. Anyone on blood thinners should discuss vitamin K2 with their doctor, since K2 affects clotting factor production and may require anticoagulant dose adjustments under monitoring. Anyone with diabetes medications should never apply the postprandial glucose tricks without medical coordination, as the combined effect can produce dangerous hypoglycemia in the first weeks of practice. Anyone with established cardiovascular disease should discuss any new exercise routine with their cardiologist before starting, even something as mild as resistance training with light dumbbells daily. Anyone with a history of eating disorders should approach the protein and fiber recommendations carefully, ideally with the guidance of a registered dietitian or treating physician familiar with their case. Anyone currently on prescription testosterone therapy or hormone replacement therapy should not modify their treatment based on lifestyle changes without explicit guidance from their prescribing physician for safety. For everyone else without those specific conditions, the 7 corrections in this video are among the safest and best documented health interventions in modern integrative medicine practice today. The most important point I want to leave you with is that none of these mistakes are unique to me, and almost every adult over 50 makes 3 right now. The good news is that recognizing them is the first step, and applying even one correction consistently over 6 months produces measurable changes in your health markers and physical capacity. The 7 mistakes together represent the framework I wish someone had handed me at age 50, with the explanations of why each one matters at the biological level long term. One last thing before this video closes, because if you have watched this far, you are serious about taking your health into your own hands rather than accepting inevitable decline. If everything we covered, the 7 mistakes, the corrections, the science behind each one, if it clicked for you, then this is the right moment to consider the next step. The Longevity Blueprint expands on all 7 corrections across 19 short chapters. With a 30-day plan you can follow week by week, consistently throughout the entire program duration. Inside, you get the morning routines, the specific foods, supplement timing for each correction, the resistance training framework, and the science behind every daily choice made in the plan. Same evidence first tone as this channel, no miracle promises, no hype, just the practical version of everything we discuss together here every single day on this channel about science. The first link in the description is where you find it if you want the broader framework in one place for daily reference and structured practice over the coming weeks. Most adults reach 60, assuming health decline is inevitable and only treatable with prescription medications and surgical interventions after the damage has already accumulated for many decades silently. The science of the past 20 years shows that targeted lifestyle interventions can prevent or reverse much of this decline if applied consistently before certain biological thresholds are crossed permanently. The earlier you start applying these corrections, the more cumulative benefit you accumulate over the years that follow this kind of evidence-based health preservation approach, taken seriously over time. If this video clicked for you, subscribe, because there is a new video on this channel every day about strange biology and practical health science most adults never encounter anywhere. Your body is running software that has not been updated in 200,000 years, and the consequences of this evolutionary mismatch are visible in every one of these mistakes. Tomorrow's video is about something connected to everything we covered today, working through the same biological systems we discussed, but through a completely different daily input you might not expect. It targets the same underlying biological mechanisms we discussed in this retrospective video, but through a daily practice you would absolutely not expect from the underlying science.